Welcome back to Black Ops. I'm Gatti and I'm picking up the host chair from the great Ralph Tiller. Black Ops is the special web series by SpaceWatch.Global focused on security and defense in space. It's the right place to be if you want to engage in in-depth analysis and discussions about the well-known link between space assets and military operations. It's probably the closest you will ever get to a proper James Bond plot.
It's Wednesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Central Europe, and it is time for another fantastic episode of Space Café Black Ops by Dr. Emma Gatti. As always, we really appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback, and we will learn and improve based on your feedback. I am Elena Vocale, Event Coordinator at SpaceWatch.Global. SpaceWatch.Global is a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. First things first, I would like to thank all our private and corporate supporters that showed their commitment to keep our independent journalism alive. We really do appreciate that. In case you want to join the supporter team, be aware that it is just a click away from you on our website. I know many of you are familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and our daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. The latest one, published just a few hours ago, features Markus Mus-Lechner, conversation with Matt Russo, astrophysicist and sound wizard, the surprising appeal of sounds and space from the recorded at the SXSW in Austin. We also have new exciting episodes of Space Café Radio, the latest episodes with the CTO of Endurosat, Viktor Danchev, on the Toliman mission. Pretty cool insights, I can tell you. And the other latest episode of the Space Café Radio is with Andreas Lindenthal about the latest Munich Security Conference. If you haven't done so yet, check out our fresh new podcast series, The Space Economy Insights by Kevin O'Connell and Dr. Emma Gatti. Their first guest was Claire Joly of OECD. You can also find our audio series wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to become a space watcher and let the world know about it with your t-shirt or mug, visit our fan shop. It is open for you on our website. If you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive on our webpage in the event section. And of course, you can find us on YouTube. With that, my job is almost done for today. Enjoy the talk. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elena. Hello, Space Watchers. Welcome back to a new episode of Black Ops, our geopolitical series where we analyze the space domain in relation to the political climate.
Your camera is off, Emma.
My camera is completely off. Okay, yes. Fantastic. Sorry, we're having some...
We see a wonderful still from you.
Is it back now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I've been told that my camera has some issues today. I'm really sorry about this. It might happen again. Still, my voice should reach you. So I hope at least my voice will reach you just fine. If my camera is off, please send money. Let me know. Back to us. This is our third episode with our resident guest, Dr. Namrata Goswami. Good morning, Namrata. Thank you for being here with us. How are you doing today?
Good morning and good afternoon, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Fantastic. Thank you for being back. Namrata is a very well-known independent scholar teaching and researching. I was saying that Namrata is a faculty associate at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University for their Executive Masters in Global Management Space course. And she's also a consultant for Space Fund Intelligence and a guest lecturer at the seminar on India Today, Economics, Politics, Innovation and Sustainability by the Emory University. She's also the author of one of my favorite books on the topic. It's called Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, which I really warmly recommend to anyone interested in the topic. Did I reach the end of this paragraph without disconnecting?
Yes, you did.
Amazing. I call it achievement. So let me wrap up. The first episode 4 months ago, we framed the discourse and discussed in general the geopolitics of space power. So if you have missed it, please go back and watch it. It's very interesting to have an introduction. In the second episode, we discussed the main and dominant space power nowadays, obviously the US. And today we're here to discuss the elephant in the room, obviously China, the contender to US supremacy. So the burning question, of course, is that is China gonna surpass the US? Is China gonna become the first global power in 20, 30, 50 years from now? And which are the consequences of such change? Which are its allies? Which are its enemies? What is its plan to become the first global power? And of course, how and why space is a key to reach such position. And we are lucky because our webinar today falls just after 1 week after a very interesting visit of Xi Jinping to Vladimir Putin. It happened last week, and this gave us a perfect kickoff for our story today. So Namrata, the China-Russia relationship is becoming very visible, with both leaders, Putin and Xi Jinping and Xi having met over 40 times. And last week, Xi conducted his meeting after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin. So what do you make of it? Where do we stand with this story?
Sure, Emma. I think that's a great way to start because in my perspective, and I've written on this for several years now, when President Xi came to power in 2013, one of the most important strategic decisions he took was he identified Russia as the most important major power relationship. So this is not something that has suddenly happened. This was in the making between China and Russia when Xi came to power. But what is even more insightful is that this followed up on an earlier 2001 Treaty of Friendship that China-Russia signed, right? And so the context of it is that China is very much looking to build an international system in which China, as you know, is the key player, and Russia, we should not forget, is one of the major powers in the system, right? And when I use the word major power, let me qualify, right? So when I think about Russia as a major power, I am not thinking in terms of economics, right? Because as you know, Russia's economy is not doing very well, but Russia is the country with the largest number of nuclear weapons, was a key player during the Cold War as the Soviet Union, has one of the most advanced space programs, including independent launch, ability to do anti-satellite weapons, counter space capability, an ability to go to different orbits. And so in that context, this particular relationship is a continuation of that, right? So the visit that you saw that happened last week, one thing that we need to consider as well is that when heads of state visit each other, their visits are determined much ahead in time, right? So it is important to remember that President Xi's visit was probably crafted several months ago. But the timing of it is interesting because it happened at a time when the International Criminal Court, as you said, issued the arrest warrant. And that did not change President Xi's perspective because, as you know, China does not recognize the International Criminal Court, and nor does the United States, right? So it's a very interesting articulation of grand strategic posturing. And I'll end by saying that for Putin, this is a great win, because here is the country that is the alternative to the United States in terms of power projection. And President Xi, one of the major visits after COVID was to Central Asia and then to Russia, right? And so, and also, of course, to the Middle East, as you know. So you can see that China views Russia as a critical player in its conceptualization of authoritarian, if I may, international system. And President Xi, in an interview, pointed out that Putin is not just a strategic partner, but a dear friend, right? And which is interesting because Xi usually is very reticent in saying such things, but he's very, very vocal and very clear that the ICC arrest warrant doesn't make a difference to China. He has invited Putin back to China. And I'll end by saying that he penned an opinion piece in the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, where he pointed out that this particular relationship has several implications. And one is contribute to China's own sense of great power and identity. So that's how I contextualize the relationship. And space, of course, plays a critical component in that particular relationship as well.
Absolutely. So speaking about power projection, I think we need to define a bit the purpose and the vision behind China's strategy in space. Can you help us to define it? Because we learned from you that each country has a different political and strategic culture. So which is Chinese one? Can you explain us?
Sure, Emma, that's a great question. So, and it leads from the first question, right, in terms of power projection and Russia enabling that with China and China enabling Russia. So in China's contextualization of what is power projection, this was a theoretical, for your audience, so this was a theoretical conceptualization that was put forward by Deng Xiaoping, right? So Deng was the leader that came after Mao Zedong, and Deng pointed out that if China is to become a great power, say in the 21st century, it is very important for China to understand the concept of comprehensive national power that leads to power projection, right? And I'll explain to you what that means. So what he tasked was that he asked the China Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences to conduct a study in 1986, in which he said that, why don't you do a qualitative, meaning the skill of your people, their will to power, leadership capability, which is very qualitative in nature, but also a quantitative assessment. So what do you need in terms of strategic technologies, right? Economic, space, artificial intelligence, concepts like that were already being thought about at that time, right? And so both the institutes conducted a study, and this is what they came out with. And it's a really interesting study because the China Academy of Sciences was more qualitative, but the China Academy of Military Sciences was more quantitative, what requires to be done. And so in their conceptualization, the comprehensive national power of a country comes from 4 critical indicators. One is its economic gross domestic product and purchasing power capability, but context matters, right? So what can a Chinese yuan buy in China and not in the developed world? So it's a very interesting conceptualization. So economic capability. The second important capability among the 4 capability was military. So do you have the military across domains? And at that time, space was not such a critical part of China's thinking, but they projected out that one day it will become very important. So what kind of space capability do you need? And we can unpack that as we go forward in this discussion. The third capability, which they talked about, is do you have the industrial capability? So economic power means resources. Is your society able to generate that? Do you have the military capability? And then do you have the industrial capability, meaning manufacturing, right? And final capability was education. So do you have the education skill set? And so all this is in their conceptualization of comprehensive national power, and added to that was diplomacy, right? Does China have diplomatic power? So based on their CNP indexes, China argued that by the early 21st century, China's ability to project economic, military, informational power is going to rise, because China's ability to generate those capabilities in those indexes they identified will grow. This was a prediction, and it turned out to be true, right? Because Deng brought about the reforms, and that led to the rise of China, double-digit growth, right? And now they're not in that level, but they have developed as well, right? And so power projection is that, and this is where I'll end. So it's a very clear power projection. It's not absolute power projection. So in their contextualization, the fact that they can project power can go to Russia and create a completely alternative narrative vis-a-vis the Western press and the US tells you that US power is declining and China's power is rising. So that's power projection, right? So it's always relative to where the United States, the dominant power in the system. And they're very clear. In 1986, they identified that. And what is insightful is that the Academy of Military Sciences study said that US power will decline. Internal issues and external capability. And that's how they project power. And so today they're in the operationalization phase, right? In the 80s, they were in the theoretical conceptual phase of what is needed. They spent nearly 50 years developing that capability, watching the United States. And today they're able to actually show you that they have that power in quantitative terms. So that's what I mean when I say power projection.
And how does space fit in the CNP?
Yeah, so space is part of their strategic technologies, right? Okay. So space, and this is something that I think we need to, it's a great point you brought up, because I think sometimes there is a misunderstanding that China's space program is an end in itself. But actually what is important is that China's space program is part of that means to an end conversation. So space is part of strategic technologies that will build their comprehensive national power. And the more they're able to project power in space, the more they're able to show their capabilities in space, from low Earth orbit to cislunar space, which is the space between the Earth and the Moon and beyond. The more China will build up their comprehensive national power, that would lead to China's rise in the system. So space forms a very critical part of their conversation in terms of power projection.
So space forms a very critical power of this conversation. I suppose also China has some strategic key points within these space strategies, correct? What are the more important goals within this space strategy?
Sure. So if you think about China's space strategy, they have identified 3 critical goals, right? And these are the goals and the means to get there. So the one goal is that space should contribute to China's economic development. So this is connected to their understanding of comprehensive national power. So in China's understanding of comprehensive national power, economic power is the most important power. Everything else flows from it, right? And they have seen this as with regard to the US or the developed world, and they've taken lessons from that. So when they invest in space, they argue that space should contribute to their economic prosperity. It should enable future resources extraction capabilities. So they have a program in terms of space strategy that looks at outer space, including the moon and asteroids, as a possibility of resource extraction. So that's the first important strategic focus of their space program. The second important goal of China's space program is to go beyond the Cold War concepts of establishing a capability or a technology to go to the moon, for instance, and come back. That's not what China is looking at in terms of its space goal. So when you listen to their articulation of their space goal, they are talking about building a robotic space logistics system, by which I mean logistics like your interhighway, for example, or the Autobahn in Germany, which connects one point to the other and is efficient. So a very similar concept China is developing, that they want to see space as part of that larger ecosystem and to build permanent presence. So low Earth orbit, where they already have presence now, they want to build a research station with Russia on the moon. And then finally, they want to have the ability to go to Mars and to asteroids to be able to utilize it for resource extraction. The final goal in terms of their space program is connected to their military space capability. So in terms of their military space capability, there are, I think, about 5 important props that they are developing. One is they are developing their communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance system. So according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the US-based DIA agency estimates in March of this year, China has about 250 ISR satellite, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So that's a very important capability they're building. The second important military capability that they are building, which will add to their further goals in terms of comprehensive power, civilian presence, is the ability to hold adversary satellite systems vulnerable, right? So they're building counter space capability as a space goal, which includes the ability to jam, include the ability to spoof, which are all non-kinetic, right? So these are ways to disable a satellite without coming in direct contact. But they also have direct anti-satellite capability, right? They launched a satellite anti-ASAT weapon in 2007. They have built that. And then the final military capability that they have done, and they were the first nation to do it, is to constitute a separate space force, right? So China was the first nation in 2015, December, that established the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. And so the idea behind this, as President Xi has pointed out, is that they needed a new force that understood space as its own domain, by which they mean space is a critical part of joint operations, information warfare, as well as presence capability and dominance capability. And then the important thing he pointed out is that to deal with this emerging future conceptualization of warfare, the PLA Strategic Support Force will be the force that will build new doctrines, right, in terms of guidance. So those are the goals that they are working on. And I think what helps them is that their space program is conceptualized under a civil military fusion strategy, right? So they don't differentiate between their civilian and military space program. Almost all their programs are directed by the People's Liberation Army. And so those are the few goals that they are focused on. And as we move forward, I can talk a little bit about some of the specific. So this is important to realize about China, right? They have short-term goals, which includes building this LEO constellation, for example, their national satellite constellation by 2025, 2030. They have the desire to build the low Earth orbit space station, which is a permanent presence. They want to go to Mars. But then they have also very long-term goals, which are articulated to about 2050, 2049, right? And I can speak to that once we move forward in our conversation.
Let's start from the short-term goals. You mentioned the moon, you mentioned Mars, you mentioned asteroids. This seems quite pretty close goals. I mean, we know that, going back to the first question, China and Russia, they do already have an agreement for a permanent moon base. Can you help us to understand why, I mean, you partially already say that, why the moon is so critical for China, and what's their strategic approach to the moon, what they want to do, how they want to use the moon, and on which point they are into the development of this project.
Oh, great. So you always ask the best questions. So very strategic too. Yeah. So anyway, so the point, so it's an important thing to contemplate. Why the moon, right? And why is it so strategically critical for China? So when China visualizes the moon, they see it as a very important real estate in the system, right? So we know that almost all spacefaring nations want to have the capability to go beyond low Earth orbit, right? Till now, we are very much stuck in the orbital dynamics of Earth, right? But the desire is that you go forward. So what does the moon bring? So the moon brings three very important strategic capability. One is that it teaches a particular civilization, and China views itself as a civilizational state, the ability to succeed and survive in a body other than Earth, right? So the idea is that the moon can be used as a habitat, right? So once you build a permanent space research station by 2036 with Russia, they will then scale it up using artificial intelligence, robotics to then support human presence. So which should happen very shortly after that, right? And so they're already training for that. They already have tested a human-capable spacecraft that came back last year. They already have tested their space plane. They have already tested their Long March 8 and Long March 5 rockets. They want to build their Long March 9 rocket, which is a heavy lift rocket, which is reusable. Now, the second important reason why the moon is so critical is that, and this is something that China's space scientists point out, and I think this is a conversation that is also present in the US and India, which also views the moon as very important. So from the Chinese perspective, the first perspective is that you use the moon to become spacefaring, understand to live in another celestial body, the eighth continent of Earth, if I may, right? Then the second important reason why the moon is so critical is that the moon has resources, right? The moon has helium-3 that China is working on in terms of nuclear fusion capability. The moon has water ice in the South Pole, which they have identified as a place for their research station that can be turned into oxygen, that can be turned into rocket fuel, that can sustain life, right? And finally, the moon also has rare earth minerals, right? It has iron ore, it has silicon that can be used for the construction of rockets, if I may. Now, the final reason is the most strategic reason, right? So in the Chinese conceptualization, launching from Earth is the most non-strategic thing to do if you want to go to space, right? I was just recently in a Falcon 9 launch in the Kennedy Space Center, and what I realized was that we need so much fuel to get off Earth because Earth is the deepest gravity well in the system, right? So in the Wu Wering, who's the chief lunar scientist, points out that if China is able to establish all those first two steps, right, the ability to launch from the moon, because of its, it doesn't have the same gravity pressures that Earth has, it's 22 times more efficient, right? So you don't need as much fuel. So think of it, like, right? So if you have, for example, if I use my phone, this is your rocket, right? So when you're launching from Earth, fuel is still here, right? The only little capability for humans and satellites. If you launch from the moon, you have that much, right? If you want to become a deep space faring civilization. So those are the reasons why China is invested in the moon. And then there is a dual use reason, which I don't think there has been a lot of thinking. So almost all our satellite systems are looking down on Earth, right? From low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit. The Chinese argument is that if you have a satellite system construction in cislunar space, you can look down on the satellites that are on LEO and GEO and can even disable them. Because US satellites are not looking up, they will never find out. So that's another reason. That is not in their official policy, but there is that strategic conversation about why building a system on the moon is so critical.
So how about the asteroids? Same approach? Same idea of using the mineral, like the resources?
Yeah, in their arguments, so the China Academy of Sciences has a project on building up asteroid mining capability, right? So the argument given is that China is now today the leader on rare earth minerals, right? But this might not be the case forever. China will be very developed. China would need resources and fossil fuels are going to run out. So we need to have another source of resource extraction. And near-Earth asteroids, as you know, and NASA has great estimates on this, has a lot of resources that if we can get to it and are able to extract it and build that logistic system, we will benefit, right? And so the reason for asteroid is very economic for China. So they call it the space mining economy that will contribute to China's long-term health, right? And the conceptualization is that today we as humanity have not proven that technology. It's very difficult, but we cannot say that we will never do it if we invest. So where are they in terms of these programs is the question you asked. In terms of their lunar program, they already have been able to robotically bring samples back from the moon and on time. In 2020, right? They landed on the far side of the moon in 2019, the first country to do so. 2024, they are going to go to the South Pole of the moon and try to bring back resources, a sample of the South Pole to see what they are made of, right? By 2028, what they hope to do is that, and this is something which is so interesting, Emma. So in the original press release from the China National Space Administration, China wanted to do this. 2028, they will do a survey of the South Pole for its resources. And then 2030 is when they will start doing the construction, right? Now they have pushed the date ahead. So now they're saying that they will do the survey and the construction by 2028. And they're already simulating it on Earth. So they're already demonstrating that capability. And when I look at China's simulations, for example, for the lunar sample return, they simulated about 650 times for 10 years. So it's a long game, right? We think that it's suddenly happening, but it started a long time ago.
Way before, of course.
Yeah. So for their construction of the base, they've already simulated a lunar lab in Beihang University. They've already started building the required ecosystem. And just recently, China harvested rice in the Tiangong space station, showing that seeds can be grown and rice can be grown, which is an important conceptualization. So they are very close to launching their lunar South Pole sample return next year. Now, if they succeed in that, that's going to be a game changer because no other nation has actually landed on the South Pole, right? And so we'll have to wait and see if they succeed in that.
So speaking again about the moon project, the moon program, how does it compare to Artemis, and are they effectively ahead of the Artemis program or ahead of the States?
Yes, so the Artemis program that the United States established, and that's why our title is so great, right? As a primary challenger to the US, so in space. So the Artemis program that the US announced under the Trump administration and has now been supported by the Biden administration was a reaction to China's Chang'e 4 mission, right? So I think till China landed on the far side, the US space and strategic community had this tendency to undermine Chinese space capability, right? So the argument I would hear is that China is just repeating Russian technology and it's building Russian-like launch systems. But I think landing on the far side completely changed the game because Russia's never done it, right? Mm-hmm. So they told you that China has moved ahead and then they land on Mars, right? And communicate back from Mars, which Russia couldn't succeed in doing, right? The Soviet Union landed, but never communicated back. So the Artemis program was a reaction to it. And today, what is interesting is that the Artemis program has, of course, the landing system called the Space Launch System, which is expendable. And then they are, the human landing system will be the Starship, right, which SpaceX is building. The Artemis program, and this is what I think, Emma, I might be proven wrong, right? So the Artemis program had deadlines of 2024 for humans, 2028 for a base, right? And then further on, a permanent base. I think China has pushed ahead. I thought China was not reacting to this, right? But now China has pushed their research base building to 2028, which means that they are competing with the US in terms of who's going to establish the base first, because that will have legal implications, right? So once you have a permanent structure on the South Pole, it'll be very difficult for someone else to build a permanent structure there, right? And the South Pole is important of the moon because that's where the resources are, right? And so you can see that they're starting to escalate their capability. There is one way the Chinese Chang'e program differs from the Artemis program, and which is that the Artemis program does not have the grand scale ambition that China has, right? So when I listen to the Artemis articulation, it's about sending back the first woman. I've spoken this earlier in your program.
Yeah, we discussed about that.
The first person of color. It's a very small base camp. And even if I look at Biden administration's cislunar strategy, they talk about extraction, but that's not the focus, right? It's more space exploration, space science. The Chinese Chang'e program, on the other hand, is very clear about why they're investing on the moon, right? It's not about proving that they can send the first Chinese taikonaut. That's part of the game, but that's not the focus, right? The focus is that it is really critical that Moon and the Chang'e program becomes a contributor to China's grand thinking about space resources, right? So, and they're very clear in that articulation and including from their heads of their mission. And so they differ in that regard. So we'll have to wait and see which particular narrative wins out, but because demonstration matters, but that's how they differ. But they are reacting to the Artemis timelines.
And speaking about locations, I just read an article by Andrew Jones who pointed about the fact that many locations chosen by the US and China are overlapping. So it's going to be a matter of who arrives first, which is what you were mentioning with the South Pole. Once you're there, you're there.
Yes, and that is their strategic culture, right? So one thing that your audiences would probably have a lot to react to is that when you think about China's strategic culture, think about their invasion of Tibet, right? Think about under the Qing dynasty, they argued that Tibet was always part of the Chinese conceptualization of who they are, right? Despite the fact that the Qing themselves were Manchus, they were a foreign, power. And so the Tibetan argument was that, well, no, but that was not Han Chinese. We were actually guiding them. But the Chinese argument is that, no, we were there first. So we claim Tibet because Tibet is critical for us. Mm-hmm. Very similar argument about the South China Sea, similar argument with Japan about the East China Sea island. And so in their strategic culture thinking, first presence results in advantages. And this is what Li Peiyang, Wu Wearing has been pointing out, and they're telling it to their own people, that for China, the moon is very similar to the South China Sea islands. Mars is similar to the Japanese island that they have, a dispute over. And so if they do not establish presence first, they will lose out, right? And so, your point that there is overlap and that first presence will really matter is a very critical part of their strategic thinking.
So should the US be worried about this race and about the fact that China is going so fast? Because from what you just said, it seems to me that until a few years ago, the US didn't really take China seriously.
Yeah, I mean, the important point is that the US should be concerned because China's capability in space has increased tremendously. China has the economic resources. We don't know how much COVID will impact long term, right? And the fact that Russia, now they're having to support Russia as well, but they're benefiting from Russia, right? They're getting oil at very discounted prices, which means they're saving too, right? So the deals that Xi Jinping signed with Russia were so one-sided, right? They were deciding even on using the yuan and the Russian ruble as currency. So I think the US should be concerned because the fact that China has missions already for next year for the moon, the fact that they have this long-term presence argument, the fact that they have the capability to do it, right, and have demonstrated the capability, and not just as an end in itself, because of the articulation that they want to establish a completely alternate system of norms, regulations, how will these particular areas be governed? What kind of legal system should be there? I think should be of concern. And that's why I draw your audience back to that comprehensive national power assessment, right? Because Chinese thinkers predicted this. They said that in the 21st century, the ability of the US to ensure that conflicts do not happen between great powers and invasion like Russia in Ukraine will not happen, will come down. Right? And China will play a very important role and a similar role in space. So I think the US should be concerned given the fact that they have that thinking.
So I'm going to close. I want to wrap up because I already see so many questions. I want to give the audience the chance to discuss with you and interact with you. I know that that's the best part. So I'm going to wrap up before moving to the discussion with the final question about something that just recently happened. So I wanted your opinion about what do you make about the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, canceling the Rashid 2 rover that was meant to fly on China's Chang'e 7 mission. I know that it's something that where the US export control rules ended up in the middle. It's quite an interesting story, but I want you to tell us the story and your opinion about it.
Yes, absolutely. So the United Arab Emirates is playing a very important role in terms of space capability, right? They are the first Arab nation to get to Mars, an orbiter that they sent. And then just now in April of this year, if iSpace of Japan lands successfully on the moon, the first commercial entity, Rashid 1, which is a UAE rover, will be a part of the mission, right? So the Rashid 2 was a continuation of that, but with China's Chang'e 7. So when I listen to the articulation that has been explained here, there is an argument that this is because of the geopolitical tensions, right? And the United Arab Emirates being a part of the Artemis program was somehow influenced by the United States, right? But I think, as you mentioned, I think the Chinese assessment is very interesting, right? So they had carried out some assessment, they have published it. So and I'll give you my opinion on it. So their argument is that it's because of the international traffic on arms regulation, right? So because of IATAR, because as you know, the Wolf Amendment bans any US originated or US satellite technology or rover technology to be by any means contribute or get into China's territory. That's not allowed. It comes under export control. So the UAE had to cancel because of that, right? So my own opinion is that I think all these factors matter, right? One was that there was that geopolitical conversation that how can a middle power be part of both systems, right? You are on one hand part of the Artemis program, but you're also part of the, if I may say, competitor nations lunar program, right? You had to take a stand somewhere, right, of where you stand. And I think that probably played a role. As I said, Emma, this is an opinion. It is not my fact, but an opinion, a perspective I have. And I might be proven right, or I might be proven wrong on this, right? And then, of course, IATAR. IATAR is extremely restrictive vis-a-vis, especially, I mean, it's so restrictive in terms of allied nations like Australia, right, or Canada. So I can imagine the restrictions that kick in because of the Wolf Amendment of 2011 that China faces when it comes to any kind of collaboration with a US strategic partner. And UAE, so let's build a scenario quickly before we go to your question. If the Rashid II was completely built in the UAE with their own contribution, with no collaboration and no Artemis collaboration that is possible, it might not have happened, right? And if UAE was not part of the Artemis Accord, so that's a possible scenario.
So that was the problem. The problem is that UAE is playing with both parties fundamentally.
It's a bit like Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is also doing.
We will have a special episode dedicated specifically to these double players, and we will see where they go, what's their strategy. So I'm really looking forward for that. Okay, Namrata, thank you very much. I'm going to go straight into the question because I already see there are many people that want to discuss with you. Daniel asking me, are the links to the first two talks? Of course, they are on our website. Just search for Black Ops and you will find all the two previous episodes. Sorry, I just saw in the chat appearing. So just to give you the quick answer. Okay, let's start. First of all, I want to just say this about Namrata being wrong. Last year, before all this, I had the chance to interview her for the first time, and I asked her opinion about China and Russia regarding Ukraine, because China just publicly condemned Russia in terms of Ukraine invasion. And I say, what do you think about this? They publicly condemned them, but do you think they're still friends? And she was like, I just look at the facts, Emma. And now, 8 months later, here are the facts. So I think this is about Namrata being wrong. She's rarely wrong, or she does just very good predictions. Okay, let's start from Colleen. Colleen asked, Dr. Goswami, what do you think about the meeting in Moscow? China going to Russia instead of Putin going to China. Do you think this has a profound meaning, the fact that was Xi going to Moscow rather than the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, Putin did visit China in 2022, right, in February. So heads of states do not meet so often. So just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, February 24, if I remember correctly. And so Putin visited Beijing during the Olympics and had several meetings with President Xi, and they signed a joint statement, which is a very long statement, about 6,000 words, in which China agreed to the Russian position on Ukraine, right? That this is because of NATO expansion. So China argued that Russia has legitimate interests. So this is a return visit. that President Xi must have planned several months in advance, and maybe a year in advance. And so the fact that it was Xi going to Moscow and not Putin going to Beijing is not such a important strategic thing, right? Because he's done that a year ago.
Before.
And President Xi has now invited Putin back to Beijing. I think this is just part of how heads of states behave. The critical importance is that President Xi knew the implications of this and understood the strategic implication of showing this as how China is now defining the narrative, right? And Putin is definitely coming across as the junior partner. So I think that's the more symbolic value.
Interesting, very interesting. Next question by Bruno Reynaud from the University of Porto. Dr. Goswami, you mentioned Deng's seminal decision. So how does President Xi compare to the previous leaders? In what way is his view is more impactful?
Yes, great. So when I think about the presidents before Xi, for example, Deng and then Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, right? So what is important is that one thing we have to remember is that the connecting thread between the earlier leaders and President Xi Jinping is the Communist Party of China, right? And they're all part of the same party. And this particular studies that were commissioned by Deng was to provide a conceptual framework of how China can become, in their words, rejuvenate themselves, right? So they viewed themselves as a great power historically, and then they wanted to become a great power again. And so Deng's idea was that, how do you build to that particular position? And Hu Jintao followed with that, Jiang Zemin followed with that, with the three represents, right? Opening up the Communist Party of China beyond just peasants to the entire Chinese population. And so how I would differentiate between the earlier leaders and President Xi Jinping is this, right? So the earlier leaders, they built up the capability, but they were less assertive when it comes to China's power projection, right? So Deng, remember, he had that famous, which was repeated a lot of time, the characteristics where he said that China needs to lie low, bid their time, to riches to be glorious, so become an economic power, but do not challenge the system. Jiang Zemin was also very diplomatic. He was very much supportive of the space program, but he was very careful not to show it as a threatening domain to the United States, right? Hu Jintao was about the peaceful rise of China, and yet he also kept building the capability. Where Xi differs is that when he came to power, he gave a famous speech in Kazakhstan where he said that the Chinese world order is something that the China dream works towards, right? And China will no more be, China will assert its rights and legitimate rights and core rights, right? And so he is now, and this is how I see it in a strategic way. So Deng till Hu Jintao were more theoretical, conceptual, building capability. President Xi is now operationalizing it, right? So he has the capability, the power, the resources. The CCP is very much dominated by him, and he has now made him president for life, right? Which was different from who was for only 2 terms, right? And so that's how I differentiate between these leaders.
Thank you. Very interesting, the differentiation between the theoretical and the operative leaders. Yeah. So there is a question by Christophe on Space Force. I'm really pleased because you mentioned it before. So this is good that we're going back to that topic. So Christophe is asking, in terms of US Space Force capabilities, beyond a brown water concept of orbital defense, shouldn't the US Space Force also develop a blue water concept of cislunar defense and deterrence, since China is bound to try and control cislunar space and ultimately the moon and the entire solar system, because why not?
Yes, well, that's a great question to ask, because I just listened to General Chan Salzman's testimony on March 14th. He's a chief of space operations after General Raymond. And he basically, when I was listening to him, I got the feeling that he was also very brown water, right? So he was talking a lot about China's co-orbital capability, kinetic ASAT capability, jamming capability, but it was all about the joint operation, right? It was a lot about low Earth orbit focus. He talked about proliferated LEO, and then he talked about GEO to an extent, but not really. See, the point is that, and that question is critical. So I didn't hear him talk about the Earth-Moon system, what China is actually doing there, the fact that China has the only really satellite there and are thinking about putting satellites even more in cislunar space, right? So in my perspective, I would classify General Salzman's testimony as very tactical, right? So very much thinking about the end for joint operations in terms of space as a support. I would say that for the Space Force to be able to anticipate the future of what China is planning, I think it will be critical for the Space Force to adopt a cislunar tactical strategy as well. So by tactical, I mean, what kind of capabilities would it need, right? For example, NASA is building the LunaNet communication system, right? PNT, GPS enabled, which is just for the moon, which will solve the latency problem, right? So the Space Force should be a part of that, right? The Space Force should develop cislunar space domain awareness, right? It shouldn't be just limited to the orbital dynamics of Earth, right? And so to answer your question, Christoph, it is extremely critical for the Space Force to have two different strategic mapping. One is the mapping from 2023 to say about 2028, right? In which it builds up its capability in low Earth orbit, has a proliferated LEO system so that Chinese counter space or Russian counter space cannot kill their entire system. But then from 2028 to say 2036, the cislunar capability has to be built, right? Because that's where China is going. So you will have to build systems and think today of what systems do you require to build that capability. So by that, I mean, what kind of public-private partnership will it need? What kind of training? Training is important. Would it need? Is it going to be just satellite focused, right? Which does not really make you a Space Force, right? So in the true sense of the term. So I think it's very critical in my perspective to have that grand strategic tactical thinking, which I don't see it reflected today, right? And so I think it's important. So the Blue Water School and the Brown Water School both are important, and there has to be a mapping of both schools in terms of capability building.
So just a technical question that I wanted to ask you before, just to be sure that I understood. When you were discussing before the Space Force program in China,
yeah,
did China invented or thought about a separate Space Force before the US?
They seem to. So this is interesting, right? So China has been thinking about space because of what it saw happen in the Gulf War in 1991, right? So till that time, and until that time, China was not, it thought about defense and deterrence and compellence. Again, there is a difference in how China thinks about compellence and how the US thinks about compellence, right? So in academic speak, compellence means that you use a strategy. For example, if I want to compel Emma to do something, right? I will target her vulnerabilities. I'll have the capability to destroy, infrastructure. So that's the kind of thinking. But what is important is that in the US compellence thinking, it could lead to escalation, right? So once I compel a country to behave in a particular manner, that country might escalate the conflict, right? But in the Chinese thinking, compellence is not really about escalation. Compellence is where you convince the other country to behave in a particular manner that is to your benefit, but then you de-escalate immediately, right? And so I would say that such kind of strategic thinking will play a great role in terms of how China views space and how the US views space and how different they might be in terms of even thinking about behavior in terms of strategic end goals, right? And so, yes, so that's the kind of distinction I think we have to keep in mind.
So Vignesh is asking, how is the funding for space program being done in China? How is that China has large private players in the space domain acting simultaneously?
Can you repeat that question again so that I understand the technicality?
So I think the first part means, how is the funding for the space programs in China how does the funding works, I suppose. The second part, I'm not sure I'm understanding it. It means how is that China has large private players in the space domain acting simultaneously? I think I'm understanding the first part of the question, not the second one, Vignesh, but maybe we can try to address the first part.
Yeah, let's address the first. But just to go back to your earlier question, because I should have answered that. And so in China's thinking, having a separate space service started around the 1990s. But then and remember, then we had President Hu Jintao and others who were a little careful because they thought this would be assertive and escalatory, right? So the idea that you need a separate space service, you need specially trained space operators was already there in their mind. And they were building capability like the Beidou system, their counter space capability, right? 2007, they had the anti-satellite weapon tests and simulation. And so when President Xi came to power, he immediately identified space as a very important strategic technology for the PLA. And what he also said that we need a separate service so that we can concentrate on developing space expertise and through that entire grand strategic map of national rejuvenation, right? And that's where they established it. But the thinking started around, I would say, 1991, 1992, right? Now, to come to your funding question. So how does China, I think if I understand the question, where does the funding come from for China's space program? Yes. It comes from the government. So most of China's funding, China does not publish official document as to how much they're spending, unlike the US that funds it and has to, for Congress has to approve it, right? So the funding comes from the State Council. The priorities are decided by the Politburo, the standing committee that looks at science and technology. And most of their funding is generated from the government. But having said that, what is interesting is that in the last few years, since 2014, when the State Council issued a document called Document 60, where they pointed out that China needs to invest in their private space capability and build private space actors, they are also starting to get funding from diversified sources, right? Like Chinese investors funding their space program, Huawei getting interested in the space research and design, and LinkSpace, OneSpace. So they get funding from the government, but they're also generating funding from the private sector. What I haven't seen is whether they're able to generate foreign direct investment. They're trying, but I haven't seen that kind of FDI flow. But I am sure that will also happen because China is scaling up their investment strategy for space.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Namrata, but in China, exactly like what you mentioned between the civil and the military, also the line between private and public is very fluid, correct?
I mean, if you think about the commercial actors that they have established, at least institutionally, you can see that they are so-called private, right? Okay. But they have deep connections with the Chinese state space institutions. And what is even more important legally is that China passed the 2021 National Defense Law, under which every technology entity, including space, has to work for the national defense. And if they don't, they can be criminally tried. So it's a very different system from the US. You cannot imagine such a law in the US forcing SpaceX to behave in a manner that the US wants, right? You can already see differences emerging in vis-a-vis SpaceX and Ukraine and how that has worked out, right? So there are deep differences between the Chinese, as you mentioned, private entity and a US private entity. So the demarcation line is very fused.
Last two questions. I promised that we could take 5 extra minutes just because I knew today was a very important episode. Mark Mayer, in which way can we still work? I'm going to try to rephrase it, Mark. In which way we can still work together and share the knowledge for the profit of developments of others? So I mean, to which extent is still a good idea to share knowledge and collaborate, and to which extent instead is not? We should start to keep our stuff for ourselves because there is an open competition. I think this is what he meant.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, the one way that there can be some level of collaboration is to build a space traffic management and space domain awareness system, right? So China is going to launch their own national constellation of about 13,000 satellites. They have private sector launching. The US has so many satellites being launched under SpaceX, right? Around 6,000 active satellites today. So I think to be able to converge on some level of space traffic management in low Earth orbit is critical, because we need to know the access paths to space. And one thing that we need to ensure as, if I may, as humanity, is that this does not lead to collisions and more debris being created, right? So that way, China and the US can actually collaborate within the United Nations Office on Outer Space Affairs to build that system, right? The other way they can also collaborate is, for example, share Mars data. For example, when China was launching to Mars and NASA was launching, they did share data in terms of position, right? So that's possible because those are for very practical reasons.
Yes.
I think where deeper collaboration comes and faces obstacles is that because China's space program contributes to their intercontinental ballistic missile capability, and because they had the reputation of fusing both, and they have not demarcated that they have anti-satellite capability, I think the concern is that if US technology falls into their hands inadvertently, they can use it to then deter or threaten the United States, right? So very high level scientific collaboration is difficult today because China is not able to show to the US that these are absolutely separate institutions, right? And so a fact I would point out is that the India-US nuclear collaboration was possible because India was able to show that their civilian nuclear energy program and their nuclear weapon program is completely separate, right? And so China has not been able to prove that case and has proliferated, right? There are allegations that China shared technology with Pakistan and that fell into North Korean hands, right? And so there is that. It's an allegation, but that's a concern.
So everything that is even vaguely military and defense related, it becomes difficult, thorny. Last question by Nabila. Nabila, I'm going to try to paraphrase this one and rephrase it. You mentioned that the China program is reacting to the US Artemis program. This is slowly becoming a space competition between these two countries, China and the US. Do you think that the international world, I mean, I suppose it means other countries, will somehow be influenced by this competition? And I suppose it means, will they have to choose on which side of the fence to stay? Nabila, I don't know if I'm rephrasing this correctly, but I think this is more or less what you mean.
Yeah, I think what is meant is that nations like middle powers might have to decide. Like
exactly,
right,
yes.
Decide. So yeah, I mean, I think so. It's very interesting. It's like a security feedback loop, right? So the US responds to the Chang'e 4 landing and then establishes the Artemis program and then gives out the timeline. And China realizes that, oh, its timeline is behind. So it pushes up its timeline, right? So, so there's an action, reaction, action cycle. So I think in terms of the larger question, I think it will force nations to choose, right? So the China-led lunar program is viewed and perceived as a very authoritarian system, right? It's supported by a one-party system. Their aspiration is to enable their lunar program to then turn China into a major power, which has implications for your future, right? And the US program is represented as a very democratic program based on bilateral collaborations, open preamble, and will lead to a very legal rule-based order, right? Which is the order we have today, where we can have our freedoms and liberties recognized. So I think based on those two different conceptualization, nations will be choosing. Now, having said that, I've also noticed a tendency among nations to join both camps, right? So it'll all depend on how China or the US negotiates. But if you look at the Belt and Road Spatial Information Corridor, you have several major European nations as part of it, right? Even today, the membership of the BRI has gone up from 140 last year to 153. And so African nations are part of it, Southeast Asian nations are part of it. So there will be a tendency to hedge and decide. So this is how nations will decide. Okay, they'll decide on the value-based system, but they will also decide on who is bringing the money and building their infrastructure, right? So nations want to build their space infrastructure. They want to build their space competency. And so it can't be just because it's a feel-good value system that you join. You also see, okay, I am joining the US Artemis system. How much is the Artemis system going to develop my own space capability? Because here is China saying that if you join my program, I am going to build your space infrastructure by lending you money, right, through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And so that's what nations will base their decisions as well. So it's complicated, but that's how human civilizations have worked.
We're going to see if this lending of money is going to happen or not, because you can also promise money and then never
yes
and never let them never let it happen. Let's see okay, we're 5 minutes late and we knew that we would have had a bit of extra time. I thank everyone, first of all, of course, the fantastic Namrata that has been as engaging and incredible as usual to explain us for 60 minutes such a complex topic. Thank you, Namrata, for being with us. I thank obviously Torsten and Elena and all the production of SpaceWatch.Global. And I thank all the audience with the fantastic question. We will see you in another 2 months because we're going to discuss about Russia and Japan. So stay tuned because the next one is even more interesting. We're building up and building up and building up. So let's see what happens on the other side. Elena, over to you for the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma and Namrata, for unwrapping for us the hottest topics around on space security, military, and defense. Before we say goodbye, let me remind you of the upcoming events. So tomorrow, on the 30th of March at 4 p.m. in Central Europe and 5 p.m. in Israel, we're going to have our Space Café Israel by Meidat Pariente with Harry Alsband, a space industry executive and exited entrepreneur, and one of the founders of the Israeli space industry. On the 30th of March at 8 p.m. Central European time, join tomorrow at 8 p.m. Join us in the 60-second space bar by Astro Agency on the topics interstellar messagings for collective storytelling and our Fragile Space, a year-long photography project. So looking forward to that. On the 5th of April at 6 p.m. with Dr. Emma Gatti, join our Space Café Italy with a conversation in Italian about the space industry of the Italian South. And on the 6th of April at 2 p.m., where Space Café Austria will be back with Sabine Pongruber. On the 11th of April at 8 p.m., we're going to have at an unusual time for the 33 minutes, but our Space Café 33 minutes with Héloïse Bertadier and Christopher Johnson about the new lunar policy handbook created by the conveners of the Moon Dialogues and released during the 62nd UN COPUOS Legal Subcommittee meeting last week. The latest considerations on lunar governance and policy will be discussed. On the 12th of April, we're launching a new regional chapter, Space Café Poland by Lukasz Wilczycki, and stay tuned for more. Find and subscribe all our events on Eventbrite. And as always, we would love to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And don't forget to sign up for our daily and bi-weekly newsletters. And if you want to treat yourselves with something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us in the supporter program. Thank you all very much for your interest. Thanks, Emma, for hosting this insightful talk. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week by week again. Thank you, our dear audience, for joining us today. I hope to see you at next events. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you. And bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Namrata. Thank you, Nami. It was fantastic.
Thank you.